The closing hour. The town died at midnight. That was how Mara thought of it, though she had never said it aloud to anyone. It sounded melodramatic. It sounded like the sort of thing a person said when they were trying to seem interesting at a party, rather than the sort of thing they said because it was simply observationally true. But it was true. She had worked late shifts long enough to know the precise moment the last of the evening crowd drained out of the high street. The stragglers from the Anchor, the couples who had lingered over dessert at the Italian on the corner, the teenage boys who sat at the war memorial steps with their cans until someone came and rang. And after that, the town did not sleep. It ceased. There was a difference. She had worked the late shift at the call centre for 2 years. The job paid better than days. She was saving. There was a flat in the city 40 miles east with her name on it, and there would be, once she had enough of a deposit and the first month and a small dignity of not having to ask her mother for anything again. 2 years, she told herself. 18 months now, really. She could manage 18 months. The walk home was 12 minutes. She had measured it on her phone one evening when she was new to her job and anxious about everything, checking what she could do, and the distance was manageable, that she would not be stranded somewhere unfamiliar in the dark. 12 minutes door to door, if she walked at a normal pace and the lights on Station Road were with her. She had done it hundreds of times. She knew every cracked paving slab, every temperamental street lamp that buzzed and flickered at the bend of the post office, every cat that watched her from the wall of the Victorian terrace on Cleaver Street with an expression of profound indifference. She was not afraid of the walk. She had never been afraid of the walk. She told herself this often enough that it almost stopped feeling like reassurance. The town centre was a single main street with a curve in it, lined on both sides with the usual arrangement of places, a Boots, a Greggs, a phone repair shop, an estate agent with photographs of the houses in the window that she knew she could never afford, a small Tesco with shutters that came down at 10, a charity shop, a nail bar, the Anchor, a few others, newer places, things that arrived in the last decade and might not survive the next. Everything clean and corporate and interchangeable, the kind of high street that could be anywhere in England, that gave nothing away about where it was or who lived there. And then, set back slightly from the main run of shop fronts, on a stretch between the estate agents and the phone repair place, there were 2 shops that were not like the others. Mara had noticed them in the first week, and in a way that you notice things when the place is still new to you and you are paying attention to its surfaces. Later, once the walk became routine, she had stopped really seeing them. They were simply there, part of the background. The way furniture in a familiar room becomes invisible once you stop thinking about where you put it. But in the beginning she had looked at them properly, and what she had felt, looking, was a vague and sourceless unease that couldn't quite account for. The first was a watchmaker's, not a jeweller's, not the kind of place that sold watches alongside necklaces and rings and offered battery replacement service. A watchmaker, the old kind, with a single small window crowded with clocks in various states of disassembly, springs and faces and tiny mechanical innards spread on velvet trays with the remains of something surgical. A sign above the door read, Crail & Son, Horologists, established 1887, in gold paint on dark green. The lettering the formal Victorian kind you saw on solicitors' offices on old photographs. There in the second sign in the window, handwritten on card, that said, by appointments only. She had never seen the door open. She had never seen the light on inside. She had never, in 2 years of walking past at 1:30 in the morning, seen any sign that the place was occupied or traded or even belonged to the present century at all. The second was harder to categorise. It was narrower than the watchmaker's, set between it and the estate agents like a tooth in the wrong place, and its window was dark, not shuttered, not curtained, simply dark, the way a room is dark whenever a light is once contained has been entirely withdrawn. The sign above it was older than the watchmaker's sign, or looked older, faded to the point where the letters were more suggested than legible, but if you stood in front of it and gave your eyes a moment, they could resolve the words Holloway and Dent, sundries and effects. Below the faded text, in smaller letters, what appeared to be a subtitle or descriptor, though Maura had never been able to make out what it was with any certainty. Something about estate clearance, something about objects of occasion. She wasn't sure. The window contained, as far as she could tell, almost nothing. A draped length of cloak, dark red or dark brown, and on it a few items too indistinct to identify. Bottles, perhaps. A frame without a picture. Shapes that didn't announce themselves. She had asked a colleague once, a woman called Debbie, who had lived in the town her whole life, whether she knew either of the shops. The clock place? Debbie had said, in a tone of someone confirming a minor fact. My gran took something there once, years ago. They do repairs, I think, old things. You have to ring ahead. And the other one, next to it? Holloway something? Debbie had paused. Not a long pause, not a meaningful one, necessarily. I don't know that one, she said finally. I'm not sure I've noticed it. And then she'd gone back to her screen and the conversation had ended, and Maura hadn't raised it again. The first time she saw movement in the windows, she thought she had imagined it. It was a Thursday, in November, cold enough that her breath came out of the clouds, and she had her hood up, hands deep in her pockets. She was walking at pace, thinking about something. She couldn't remember now what, something from the end of her shift, a difficult call or a tedious one, and she passed the two old shops in the middle of thinking about it, and caught, in the corner of her eye, something that shifted. She stopped. She turned. The watchmaker's window was exactly as it always was. The clocks on their velvet trays, the disassembled mechanisms, the faint glint of metal in the light from the street. Nothing moved. Of course nothing moved. It was a display of static objects behind glass. She looked at the window of Holloway and Dent, the dark window, the draped cloth, the indistinct shapes. One of the shapes was in a different position than she thought she had remembered, but she didn't remember it precisely. She had never looked at it precisely. She walked past every night and her attention slid off the window the way attention slides off things that offered nothing to catch it. She couldn't be certain the shape had moved, because she had no reliable record of where it had been. She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds in the cold. Then she walked on, faster than before, and told herself firmly that she was tired. She saw it again the following Thursday. This time she was watching. She had decided, without quite articulating the decision, to watch, to pay attention to the windows as she passed them rather than letting her gaze drift ahead. Just to settle it. Just so she could confirm, with the flat certainty of someone who had looked properly, that there was nothing there, and then stopped thinking about it. She passed the watchmakers first, the clocks, the velvet, the pieces of mechanism, and at the back of the window, half in shadow, something that was not a clock and not a piece of mechanism, something taller. Something with the approximate verticality of a person, though it had no distinct outline, no feature that she could point to, just a density of shadow in the rough shape of a standing figure. She slowed. The figure, if it was a figure, did not move. It simply stood, or occupied, or was. She couldn't find the right verb for it, the right way to describe a presence that seemed simultaneously inert and watchful. She moved to the window of Holloway and Dent and looked directly at the dark glass. There were two of them in there. She was certain of it this time. Certain in a way that you are certain of things you have seen in your whole attention rather than glancing part of it. Two shapes, upright, at the back of the space behind the window, where the darkness was densest. They were not moving. They were standing. And though she could not have said she knew what it was, could not have pointed to an eye, a face, or any feature at all, she knew that they were looking at her. She walked. She didn't run. She was proud of that later, in the retrospective accounting of what her mind kept doing. She didn't run, she simply walked, very quickly, and didn't look back, and didn't stop until she was inside her front door with the chain across it, and the kettle on, and the television loud enough to fill every corner of the flat. She told herself, Old buildings do strange things with shadows. She told herself, I am working too many late shifts and sleeping badly, and I am tired in a way that makes the ordinary uncanny. She told herself there was nothing in those shops. She almost believed it. The nights passed. She varied her pace. She tried not to look at the windows and found that not looking required more conscious effort than looking, and that the decision to avert her gaze was itself a form of acknowledgement. On the nights she looked, she saw them. The vertical presences in the two old shops, standing, watching, never moving while she watched them back. On the night she tried not to look, she felt them anyway. A prickling at the side of her face, a sense of being observed that didn't diminish with distance and only eased when she turned the corner into Station Road and the shops were out of the sight behind her. She started to think of them as the figures. It was imprecise, but it's all that she had. They were not people. She was fairly sure they were not people, though she could not entirely rule out that they were not simply mannequins, display items, something entirely explicable which she had been catastrophizing in a specific way that people catastrophized when they were lonely and worked bad hours and walked home alone through empty streets. But they did not have the blankness of mannequins. They had the quality of attention, of orientation, of a thing that knew she was there. She told no one. She didn't know how to explain it in a way that didn't make her sound unwell. The night she understood they were following her was a Friday in December. It had rained earlier and the high street was wet. The sodium lights from the street lamps were pooled in puddles on the pavement in long orange streaks. She came out of the call centre at 1:25 and pulled her coat tighter and walked. Usual route. Station Road to the high street, down the high street past the Tesco and the estate agent and the old shops, left at the corner by the war memorial, down through the small residential streets to her own. She reached the stretch where the two shops stood and looked, as she always looked, directly at the windows. They were empty. Not dark, not occluded by standing shapes, empty. The watchmaker's window showed its clocks and mechanisms and nothing else. The window in Halloway and Dent was simply a dark rectangle, the draped cloth and the indistinct objects, nothing moving, nothing standing. Both shops, as they would have appeared to the casual observer, disused old premises, slightly eerie, perfectly inert. She stopped walking. The street was completely silent. The rain had stopped. There was no wind. The orange puddles held still. She was aware, with a clarity that was almost clinical, that the figures were not in the windows because they were no longer behind the glass. She looked left. She looked right. Nothing. The high street extended in both directions, empty under the lamps. Not a person, not a cat, not a car. She was alone in it. She was absolutely certain she was not alone in it. She walked faster than she had ever walked the route before. Nearly a run by not quite keeping her footsteps controlled because some part of her felt, without logic, without any rational basis, that running would change something, would signal something, would cross some threshold she was not yet ready to cross. She passed the war memorial and turned left onto the smaller streets, and the distance was the same as always, the same cracked slabs and low garden walls and parked cars. And she reached her door and let herself in and stood in the hallway breathing. From the street outside, through the narrow glass panel behind the door, she could see nothing. The street was empty. The parked cars, the lamp on the corner, nothing else. She went upstairs. She stood at her bedroom window, slightly to the side of it, looking down at the street below. A minute passed. 2. She was watching the pool of lamplight on the wet tarmac. At the far edge of the light, where the darkness of the unlit stretch began, something was standing. It was the same approximate verticality as what she saw in the shop windows, the same quality of presence without feature. It was standing at the boundary of the light, not moving, not advancing, simply present, watching her window. She stepped back. She sat on the edge of the bed. She did not go back to the window. After an hour she lay down, still dressed, and eventually, much later, slept. She considered calling in sick. She considered this seriously, not as a fantasy, but as a practical option. Sitting at her kitchen table in the grey morning with her hands around the mug and the question laid out in front of her. What would it cost her? A day's pay. A day's pay she needed, but not desperately. She could manage a day. But she would have to go back eventually. The flat was 40 miles east and she was not there yet. And until she was, she had to work, and the work was nights, and the nights ended at 12-minute walk. She couldn't call in sick forever. She couldn't take a taxi every night on what she earned. She'd run the maths and it didn't work. Even twice a week it didn't work. She didn't know anyone that she could reliably collect her at 1:30 in the morning. There was no solution, which meant that there was no point in avoiding the problem. She had to walk, and she had to keep walking. What she could do, what she decided in the grey morning she would do, was take a different route. She got out her phone and looked at a map. There was another way. Rather than going through the high street at all, she could cut off left on Station Road almost immediately before the centre entirely and follow a back route that went around rather than through. It was longer, 22 minutes rather than 12, she estimated, and she confirmed this by mapping it, but it avoided the high street altogether, avoided the old shops, avoided whatever was happening in those few hundred metres of the town's centre. It went through quieter streets, residential streets, low housing, the sort of area that was unremarkable and thoroughly ordinary. She decided she would try it. She worked her shift on Saturday. She answered calls and filled out logs, and drank bad coffee from the machine, and when the end of her shift came, she pulled on her coat and took a left turn before the high street and walked the longer route. The streets she walked, though, were quieter, even than the high street at this hour. On the high street there was at least the street lamps, at least the shop fronts with security lights and their illuminated signs. Here the lamps were more widely spaced, and several of them were out, and the gaps between the buildings were longer. Stretches of waste ground on one side where something had been demolished and not yet built upon. The chain-link fencing casting grid patterns shadows on the cracked earth. The houses on the other side had their curtains drawn, their doors shut. Nothing and no one. She was 10 minutes into the route, passing the stretch of waste ground when she'd felt it again. The prickling at the side of her face, the sense of orientation, of something pointing itself at her. She kept walking. She did not look sideways. She felt it intensify, not behind her this time, beside her, level with her, pacing her, keeping to the waste ground beyond the chain-link fence. She could not hear anything. The silence was total, the kind of silence that was not simply the absence of sound, but a quality in itself, a silence with the weight and texture. But she felt the thing moving alongside her, matching her pace, separated from her by only the width of the fence. She looked. There were two of them on the waste ground. They were standing in the open rather than behind glass, and she could see them clearly, or rather, she could see the fact of them clearly, the shape and presence of them, because there was nothing to see in the conventional sense. They were the height of people, and stood the way people stood, but they were not people. They were dark in the way that was not about light levels, dark in the way of a shape of space between the two walls is dark, a fundamental darkness rather than a conditional one. Their shapes were approximately right, but the details were wrong in ways that she could not specify, like something described to you rather than seen, like something your brain had assembled from the idea of a figure rather than the actual observed one. They were looking at her. That had not changed. Whatever they were always looking at her. And then one of them moved forward. She ran. She had told herself she would not run, had felt it in her body as a decision during the walk through the high street. Don't run, don't signal the crossing of a threshold. But here on the back route with them, two of them standing in the open, and one of them moving, she simply ran, without making the decision, without the thought preceding the action. Her body ran, and she followed it. Behind her, she heard nothing. That was the worst of it. She ran and ran and heard nothing pursuing her. Not footsteps on the pavement, no sound of movement through the chain-link fence, no noise at all, and the silence made it impossible to know if she had gained distance or lost it, if they were close or far, if they had followed her at all. She had to assume they had. She ran as though they were immediately behind her. She came off the back route early, cutting through between two houses and coming out of the street she recognised. Cleaver Street, the Victorian Terrace, the cat who watched from the wall. The cat was not there tonight. The wall was empty. 3 minutes more and she was at her door. She was breathing in high, ragged pulls. Her hands were shaking enough that she'd fumbled the key twice before she got inside. Inside, chain across, back against the door, she stood there for a long time. Then she felt it. A thin, high line of pain across the back on the right hand. She lifted it. A mark was there. Not a deep cut, not something that you would need attention, but a wheal raised in the skin, a stripe of pink running across her knuckle at her wrist, as though something had grazed her, as though something had got very close. She had not touched anything during the run. She was certain she had not touched anything. She had not caught herself on the fence or on the wall or any surface at all. She had simply run, and her hands had been in the air, and something had marked her. She stood at the bathroom mirror and ran cold water over her hand, and did not look at her own face in the mirror because she did not want to see her own expression. On Sunday night, she worked her shift in a state of such careful, deliberate, ordinary behaviour that it cost her something. A performance of herself that felt like a second job running parallel to the actual one. She answered calls. She filed logs. She drank coffee. She spoke to Debbie about a television program they had both watched, and she heard herself making the normal sounds of conversation about it. And behind all of this she was thinking, I have to walk home tonight, and they marked me. And I don't know what they want, but I am becoming certain that they will not stop. She thought about the mark on her hand. In the daylight of the morning it had faded to nearly nothing, just a faint redness, barely distinguishable from the ordinary redness of her skin. She might have imagined it. She might have caught herself on something in the panic of running and not registered it. These were possible explanations, and she listed them from herself in the way that had been listing possible explanations from the beginning. The accumulated inventory of alternatives, tired shadows, imagination, optical effects, anxiety, stress, insufficient sleep. The inventory no longer comforted her. It had not comforted her for some time. She would take the original route tonight. The back route had been worse, fewer buildings, less light, more open space, and the chain-link fence had given them something to stand behind, as though they were waiting there, as though they had anticipated the detour and arranged themselves accordingly. The high street was better, lit at least, and enclosed, and the glass of the shop windows was a boundary of some kind, a distinction between the space that occupied and the space she occupied. She would walk quickly. She would not look at the windows. She would be home in 12 minutes. She left the buildings at 1:30 and turned right onto the high street. The town was dead, as it always was. The Tesco with its shutters down, the estate agent, the charity shop. She kept her eyes forward and walked at a pace she tried to keep measured. She passed Crail and Son. She passed Halloway and Dent. She did not look. She looked at the pavement in front of her feet, at the orange light pooling on the wet stone, at the stretch of High Street ahead of her where the War Memorial waited. She did not look at the windows. She walked, and at the back of her neck was alive with the sensation of being watched, the fine hairs of it raised, and she walked anyway. She made the corner. She turned left. She was on the residential stretch, the lower streets, the familiar terrain. 1 minute, 2, the Victorian Terrace, the empty wall where the cat sometimes sat. She was nearly running, not quite. The line between walking fast and running is partially speed and partially intention, and she was trying to keep the intonation of her walking side, to keep her body under the governance of something rational and deliberate, rather than letting it do what it wanted to do, which was sprint. 5 minutes from her home. 4. She allowed herself to look back. The street was empty. The stretch behind her was as it always was. Parked cars, lamp on the corner, the junction with Cleaver Street at the far end. Nothing pursuing her, nothing standing in the road. The ordinary empty street at 1:30 in the morning. She turned back and walked the final minutes and let herself in and stood in the hall breathing, hand on the wall. She went upstairs. She did not go to the window this time. She went to the bathroom and cleaned her teeth and got undressed and got into bed and turned the light off. And she lay in the dark and her body was rigid, every muscle held tight, and she waited for something without knowing what. Eventually, exhausted in the specific way that sustained fear exhausts a person, she slept. What woke her was the quality of the room. Not a sound, not a movement she could identify. She came up out of sleep with the sudden completeness of waking that happens when something has changed, when the atmosphere of a room has altered in some way that the sleeping body detects before the conscious mind catches up. She opened her eyes. The room was not dark. That was the first thing. It was not dark in a way a room is not dark when light comes in from the street. The familiar greyish non-darkness of an urban bedroom, orange-tinged, shapeless. It was lighter than that. Outside the curtains was the very first suggestion of dawn. The sky not yet blue, but beginning to give up on the absolute blackness, beginning to acquire the almost imperceptible luminescence that precedes light. She had slept longer than she thought then. It was nearly 6. She became aware that she had not immediately looked at the room itself. She had looked at the window. She had processed the light level. Her eyes had not moved to the corners of the room, the foot of the bed, the wardrobe standing against the far wall. She had been looking at the curtains and not at the room, and now, slowly, with the terrible deliberateness of a person who already knows what they are about to see, she moved her eyes. They were in the room with her. Both of them. The same two, or the two she thought of as the same. Though she could not have said how they had distinguished from each other, they had given there no features she could point to. They were standing at the foot of the bed. They were standing the way that they'd always stood. The approximately human verticality, the darkness that was not a function of light levels, the specific quality of being orientated at her, of being aimed at her, all of their unspecifiable attention directed entirely at her face. Mara did not scream. She tried to, and found that the sound was not available to her. It was there, built up in the chest and her throat. But between the intention and the execution, something had failed. She opened her mouth and nothing came. They were smiling. That was a detail that went through her like a cold wire from her throat to the base of her spine. She had not been able to see their faces before, in the shadows, in the street, on the waste ground. They had been shapes without feature, but in the pre-dawn light of her bedroom, at the foot of her bed, 3 feet from her bare feet under the duvet, she could see their faces, and what was there in place where the faces should be, and what was there was smiling. Not with the mechanics of a face, not with muscles or teeth or the crease of an eye, but smiling in the way that is in fact unambiguous, the way that a sentence has a meaning but is not negotiable. They were smiling, and the smiling was for her, and it meant something that she did not want to know the meaning of. One of them moved. They came forward together, not moving the way things move, not walking, not crossing the space between them and her through the medium of space at all, but simply becoming closer, the distance between them contracting without the intermediate stages, so that there had been 3 feet was now 1 foot, and she was scrambling back, her shoulder blades hitting the headboard, the duvet bunched between her hands, and she found the scream then, found it and released it, and it filled the room. The one from the watchmakers reached for her. The hand, the approximation of a hand, the dark negative space that occupied the position of a hand, closed around her ankle. Cold was the first thing. The cold of it, and was not the cold of the surface or the temperature, but the cold that went inward, that moved through the skin and into the tissue beneath it and into the bone, a cold that had no outside. that seemed to begin at the centre of whatever it touched and radiated outward. She kicked. She kicked with her free leg, the heel of it, with all the force she had, and it connected with nothing, passed through the shape as though there was shadow, through smoke, through a space that had held the shape of a thing but not its substance, and then she felt the grip tighten. She pulled. She pulled with everything she had, with both arms and her whole torso, and she pulled herself across the bed away from the foot of it, wrenching her ankle free of whatever held it, and she was off to the side of the bed, feet on the floor, back against the wall between the window and the wardrobe. The two shapes were at the foot of the bed. They had not moved further. They were watching her, orientated, aimed, smiling with that featureless certainty, and they were not pursuing her into the corner. They were standing and watching the way they had always, every night that she had passed the windows, been standing and watching. Mara looked at her ankle. There was a mark there, the same kind of wheal as the back of her hand from the waist ground, but wider and darker, and in the pattern of something that held rather than grazed. She could see the impression of it, the shape of the cold grip, raised and dark red on the skin of her ankle. The light through the curtain shifted. She felt it before she saw it, a quality change in the room, something thinning, something withdrawing, the way a smell dissipates, the way sound dips below hearing. She looked at the shapes at the foot of her bed. They were still there, still orientated, still smiling, but something in the texture of them had changed. The density, the quality of their presence. They were receding, not in space but in some other dimension, becoming thinner, less material, less able to hold the weight of their own existence in the room. The light through the curtains shifted again. Outside, the dawn was arriving, not dramatically, not with the sudden brightness of a lifted curtain, but with the gradual, committed certainty of something that happens every day and has no doubts about its arrival. The sky was becoming blue. The first birds were beginning. The street outside was acquiring the colourless light of an early 6 in the morning, the light that has colour stripped out of it, the clear and universal light of before. The shapes at the foot of her bed had thinned, and thinned further, and were not there. She stayed herself against the wall for a long time. Her ankle hurt with a specific cold pain in the mark, and she'd felt it as evidence, as documentation. Something had touched her, something had held her, and the evidence of it was written on the skin of her ankle in a way that she could not argue out of. She looked at it, and knew that no inventory of rational alternatives was going to account for what was in front of her. She had reached the end of the space of which the available explanations could do any useful work. She sat against the wall until the morning was fully established, until the birds were properly loud and the light through the curtain was ordinary daylight, yellow and real, and then she stood carefully on the ankle that ached with cold, and she went to the window and drew the curtain back. The street below was as it always was in the morning, the parked cars, the front gardens, a man in a high-vis jacket walking to work with his head down. The same street she had moved into 18 months ago and walked from every night. Ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of street that asks nothing of you. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the far end of the street, at the junction with Cleaver Street and further, at the faint suggestion of a high street beyond. The turn she made every night coming home. She could not see the old shops from here. They were 3 streets over, half a town away, set back from the main road of shop fronts beyond the estate agent and the phone repair place. She thought about the 2 shops. She thought about the gold lettering on the dark green, Crail & Son, horologists, established 1887. She thought about the faded letters of Halloway and Dent, barely legible. The subtitle she had never been quite able to read. She thought about the clocks in the window, the disassembled clocks, the springs and faces and tiny mechanical innards on their velvet trays. She thought about what it meant to deal in the measuring of time, to dedicate your business, your premises, your life's work to the marking of hours, to the management of the interval between one thing and the next. What kind of people established such a business in 1807 and were still there, still present behind closed doors and appointment-only signs at 1:30 in the morning of a present day? She thought about sundries and effects. She thought about objects of occasion, and whatever the faded subtitle had said, the words she had never quite resolved from the letters above the dark window. Things that other people no longer needed, the contents of cleared rooms, the possessions of the absent, the residue of lives that had ended and moved on. She thought about what might have come to inhabit such objects, what might accumulate in the handling of them, what might come to live in the darkness of the shop that traded in reminders. She stood at the window in the morning light, and her ankle ached with cold, and she thought, they are not finished. She thought, they will be here tonight. She thought, and the night after, and the night after that, because this is what they do. This is the shape of it, the thing they have been doing since the first night she saw movement in the windows and dismissed it, the long patient practice of watching and following and waiting, closing the distance by increments, first the windows, then the street, then the waste ground, then the door she had stood with her back against for 1:30, and now in the room, and now the foot of the bed, and now the grip on the ankle, the first physical fact for them. She thought about the deposit of the flat 40 miles east. She thought about the 18 months and what they had cost her, the late shifts and the bad coffee and the walk through the dead town, and she thought about 12 more minutes and what that would cost her now. She turned from the window and sat on the edge of the bed. The duvet was bunched and disturbed from her scrambling. On the fitted sheet on the foot of the bed, where the shape's grip had been, there were 2 darkened marks on the fabric. Not stains exactly, not burns, but areas where the fabric had altered in a way that the fabric alters when something very cold has been held against it for very long. She looked at them. She did not touch them. Her phone was on the bedside table. She picked it up and held it, not opening it, not making a call. She sat and held it and breathed. The birds outside were fully singing now. The morning was established. The room was ordinary and warm, and had that particular feel of a room in daylight that was simply a room, that holds nothing but furniture and clothes, and the quiet disorder of a lived life. She sat in it, and the dawn light came through the curtains, and the cold in her ankle was already fading, degree by degree, back toward the temperature of the ordinary. She knew it could not be cold for long. She knew it would be warm, and the mark would fade, and the morning would make everything reasonable again, would lay its flat and sensible light over all of that, and make it possible to wonder yet again whether she was tired, whether she was stressed, whether there were explanations that she had not yet fully considered. She picked up her phone and opened the map. She looked at the route from the call centre to her flat, the red line on the grey street grid, the 12-minute walk, the high street with its curve, the stretch between the estate agent and the phone repair shop. She looked at it for a long time. Then she expanded the view, pulling back until the 40 miles east was visible, until the city appeared at the edge of the screen with its streets and its buildings and its flat with her name almost on it. She put the phone down. She did not know what she was going to do. She did not know if there was something anyone could do. She was not sure that anything she could choose, any route she could take, or precaution she could make, or decision she could commit to, would alter the shape of what was happening, which felt, in the cold of the morning and the altered sheets on the foot of her bed, like something that had already decided its own shape, that she was determining its own shape since the beginning, since the first Tuesday in November when she saw movement in the window and stopped and looked, and told herself that she had imagined it. She got up. She made tea. She drank it at the kitchen table and looked at the wall, and outside the morning moved through its usual stages, the traffic building, the school run beginning on the parallel street, the ordinary sounds of a town that was waking up and becoming itself again, that she was filling with light and noise and people and all the evidence that the world was simply a world. She held the mug in both hands and thought about the smile. Not the faces. There were no faces, so she could not describe a face, but the quality of it, the absolute legibility of it, the way it had meant something as clearly as language meant something, as clearly as words on a page. They had smiled because they had arrived. They had smiled because the 12 minutes had been walked and all the nights had accumulated and the distance had closed. And now they were with her in the room at the foot of her bed, and the only thing left was the final closing of whatever remained. She thought about what they were waiting for. She thought about the objects of occasion. She looked at her hands around the mug, ordinary hands, the faded mark on the right one, barely visible. She looked at them the way you look at something when you are trying to see it from outside your own perspective, to see what something else might see like when looking at you, what it might find there. She did not know what they wanted. She finished her tea and rinsed the mug, and went to get dressed for the day that would be followed by the evening, that would be followed by the shift, and then the walk, and then whatever else came after. She went through the ordinary motions of the morning, clothes, face, keys, and all the while the question sat at the base of her like a stone. What happens when the distance closes entirely? When there is nothing left between you and the thing that has been watching you? When the glass is gone, and the streets are gone, and the dark outside the door is gone, and all that remains is a room, and the bed, and the dawn that comes but does not come quite in time? She picked up her bag and her keys and went to the front door. She opened it. The street outside was a morning street, a woman pushing a buggy in the opposite pavement, a delivery van idling at the end of the road, the lamppost casting no shadow in the flat morning light. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking out of it, breathing the cold air. Then she stepped out and pulled the door closed behind her. The town was awake. The town was itself. And somewhere in it, behind glass, behind a gold sign and an unfaded one, in rooms that no one she knew had ever been inside, something was waiting for the hour when the town would die again, when the lights would come down and the streets would empty, when there would be nothing between itself and the woman who walked home through the dark. It was patient. It had always been patient. It had been there since 1887, and it knew how to wait. She walked toward the morning, and behind her the door of her flat clicked shut, and the street was quiet, and the clocks, all the clocks, in the window of the shop, on their velvet trays, in all their dissembled pieces, were ticking.